Some of my research into the encrypted knowledge left to us by Francis Bacon, including works of Shakespeare, secret societies, and the harmonic series, has been based on the inverted logo of Freemasonry that Peter Amundsen found in the first folio of Shakespeare, a piece of encoded geometry in the To the Reader poem. I share Amundsen's process of finding and recreating this upside-down logo in a video called A Right Triangle, the Shakespeare First Folio, and the Tritone, a link to which is in the description. Inverting the Masonic logo seems both strange and unnecessary. Francis Bacon, or whoever encoded it there, could just as easily have encoded the logo right side up and built the next triangle from there. Bacon is believed to have spearheaded speculative Freemasonry in England 100 years before its reveal in 1717. Why insult an icon in which he was so invested? The existence of the inverted logo became even more intriguing when I discovered another one. This one is placed above the door on the Freemasons' Hall in Copenhagen, Denmark. Inverting the Masonic logo doesn't change its basic measurements. It's still 6 by 7, 6 horizontal units symbolizing the material world, by 7 vertical units symbolizing the steps to heaven, the product of which is still 42. Francis Bacon, Douglas Adams, QED. So nothing really changes by turning it over, except that the square and compass trade positions. But might this suggest that instead of the circle-making tool taking the top prominent position in the logo, it's the square, a tool we can use to make triangles? Perhaps so. In any case, we're going to encounter a lot of triangles in this video. The Danish Masonic Lodge, built in the 1920s, is a stark and imposing building. On either side of the door are the 2 Masonic pillars of Joachim and Boaz. The building sits on one end of Fælledparken, a large city park. My partner Alan grew up in Copenhagen and helps me with Danish pronunciations. Fælledparken, how do you pronounce that?
Fælledparken.
Okay. The Masonic Lodge is also located right next door to a very modern building housing the Red Cross. The triangular steps displaying the familiar Mason technique of bricklaying used by their Masonic neighbors next door. The proximity of the Masonic Lodge and the Red Cross is interesting, as Francis Bacon was also believed to have been the driving force of both speculative Freemasonry and Rosicrucianism, the Order of the Rosy Cross. And just for fun, if we measure the triangle of bricks in front of the Red Cross building, we find angles of 21 degrees, 51 degrees, and 108 degrees. These numbers reduce down to 3, 6, and 9. And as my friends in the Ghosts of Bacon group are always reminding me, 108 is Francis in reverse cipher. It's not surprising that both of these buildings are located in a part of Copenhagen known as Trianglen, so named for this nearby triangular-shaped intersection of several different streets, a sort of angular roundabout. History, as recorded in Wikipedia, tells us that on the site of this triangular junction once stood a hospital called Vartov. We can verify this by cross-checking Google Maps with some older maps of Copenhagen. If we zoom out a little on Google Maps, we can see that Trianglen is just north of a series of rectangular lakes called the Sortedam, one of which is called Pebbling. The Pebbling waterway also appears on this 1648 map of Copenhagen, just southeast of a star fort shown here. I've marked the city's fortified wall in orange. The building was likely this square that I'll shade pink. It's marked New Wartov because the original Vartov Hospital was located on a private farm and later moved here. After preparing this slide, I found more corroborating evidence of the site from a Copenhagen map dated 1705. An illustration of New Vartov from 1646 shows a building alongside this road running up from the south. This road is the Oosterbrogade, the same road shown here in Google Maps. So, how do you pronounce that street that we were talking about earlier?
I forgot.
Oostergade, Oostergade.
Oosterbrogade.
Oh, that's right. I wasn't even close. The illustration shows that the building is surrounded by a star-shaped fortification and a moat, very typical of other star forts that can be found throughout the world. But why would this building require fortification? It was likely an inn, selling hospitality and lodging rather than medicine. But either way, it was not a military installation. Perhaps its star-shaped foundation surrounded by water had another purpose. The proximity of the modern-day Masonic Lodge near the ruins of a much older star fort might be hiding a connection. There are several star forts in central Copenhagen depicted on this 1648 map, but two more worth looking at right now are the two that create this isosceles triangle, the Rosenborg Castle and the Castellet or Citadel. These three star forts form a triangle of 74 degrees, opposite two angles of 53 degrees. It matches the dimensions of two right triangles forming the Masonic logo, which we can create here. With angles of 90 degrees, 53, and 37. Two angles of 37 degrees add up to 74. It's likely, then, that there's some Masonic intent behind the location of these angular star-shaped fortifications. So let's take a look at Rosenborg Castle. How do you pronounce Rosenborg?
Rosenborg.
Rosenborg.
Yeah.
Okay. It was built as a summer home in 1606 for King Christian IV, who we're told was responsible for many of these star fortifications in Copenhagen. As the construction of Rosenborg was finishing up, King Christian took a trip to visit his sister Anne, the Queen of England. Anne was married to James Stuart, and history tells us that Christian's visit with James in 1606 involved nothing of great importance. Apparently, James and Christian got very drunk at several parties. It's possible, though, that Christian made this trip to gather a specific type of information. According to the Scottish Lodge of Scone and Perth No. 3, King James was initiated into the Masons in 1601. Some dispute this because they view Renaissance Freemasonry as satanic and don't think it's possible that someone as pious as King James would have joined. Other researchers have concluded that Masonry didn't devolve into a Luciferian agenda until the society was infiltrated by Jesuits. We only have one piece of evidence to go on, the Scottish Lodge's record of the initiation of King James that this mural depicts. While he may have been a Mason, King James might also be loosely described as a Rosicrucian, primarily because he was a staunch Protestant. The emblem of the Protestant movement's founder, Martin Luther, was a rose, and some researchers believe the Order of the Rosy Cross was a secret society of radical Protestants using esotericism as a cover. It's interesting to note that in a speech given by Francis Bacon to Parliament, he refers to King James openly as Christian Salomon, a blatant Rosicrucian allusion to both the alchemical wedding of Christian Rosenkreutz and Bacon's own essay, New Atlantis. Historian Susanna Ackerman admits that the marriage of King James I to Princess Anne of Denmark can be described, though she won't do it herself, as an act of proto-Rosicrucianism, meaning an early attempt to forge Protestant alliances in Northern Europe. Denmark was considered to be firmly Protestant at that time, and its King Christian IV, Anne's brother, would eventually be called the Protestants' military commander. Christian IV's own strong Protestant position, the emblem for which was a rose, may have been the reason for his naming his summer home Rosenborg. But many of the features of Rosenborg we're interested in weren't yet present when the house was completed in 1606. The building still lacked its star-shaped fortification and moat. When Christian IV arrived in England to visit his sister and brother-in-law, it's likely he also ran into Francis Bacon, who had considerable influence with King James. The king had knighted Bacon in 1603 and would eventually appoint him Lord High Chancellor. But their relationship may have been much deeper than any of this. According to a cipher decoded by Jake Roberts in his book The Holy Trinity Decryption, Bacon encoded a message claiming he was the illegitimate son, not of Queen Elizabeth, but of Mary Queen of Scots, which would make Francis Bacon the half-brother of James Stuart. If you're not familiar with this particular decryption and would like to learn more, in the description below there's a link to Jake Roberts' YouTube channel, Ghosts of Bacon. So it's likely that Christian IV of Denmark would have met with both James Stuart and Francis Bacon during his trip to England in 1606. It's also likely they did more than just get drunk at several parties. What we do know is that when Christian IV returned to Denmark, additions were made to Rosenborg. By 1613, the summer home had gained a built-up star-shaped foundation and a moat. We can see how the star-shaped foundation was built up around the original 4-story house, as it now partially covers this original first-floor window. And we can also see this doorway is much lower than ground level is today. Rosenborg's website tells us the moat was dug in 1613, so this is likely the time the star-shaped fortifications were built up. The website also tells us that the moat was aesthetic and served no defensive purpose, so it must have been built for another reason. Did Christian IV learn about star-shaped foundations from James Stuart and Francis Bacon? We can only speculate, but we do know that he did not use star fort geometry to build the fortifications of his arsenal in 1604, 2 years before his trip to England. The one bastion we see here looks to be at a 90-degree angle. As we can see, only 3 points of Rosenborg's original 4-pointed star remain. If we measure the angles of the star points, we find 60 degrees on the left and 69 degrees for both points on the right. If this bastion on the right were a triangle, the presence of one 69-degree angle would mean the remaining 2 angles would add up to 111 degrees. This grouping of numbers gives us another 369. As 111 reduces to 3. If we draw a line from this star point down the middle or mise of the bastion, we see that it lines up with the tallest spire. The other 2 star points line up with the shortest spire on the other side of the house. But let's move on now to the last of the 3 star forts, the Castellet.
Castellet.
Okay. This 5-pointed star or pentagon is much larger and more deliberate than either Vartov or Rosenborg. Construction on the Castellet started in 1626, well after the Danish king's trip to England in 1606, as well as a later trip he made there in 1614. Though this fortress is monstrous, on the King's Bastion today only a few small cannons are on display, near a windmill on an octagonal base. The buildings on Castellet are military barracks and storage, but there was at one time a granary on site to feed the soldiers living there. 2 moats encircle the star fort. The thin angled line of earthworks between them originally contained 4 ravelins, these smaller detached triangles. Each ravelin housed a smithy forge. One of them is still in operation today. Measuring the angles of each bastion, we do find a slight pattern. Both pink angles at the bottom measure 71 degrees. The 2 green angles in the middle measure 62 degrees. And at the top, the King's Bastion measures 80 degrees. The angles were clearly deliberate, and each value reduces to the number 8. But there's a difference of 9 between 62, 71, and 80. There are 2 features associated with these 3 star forts: spires and/or windmills. Rosenborg had 3 tall spires on towers attached to the house. Castellet had one windmill and a few modest spires on the storehouse and church/prison. And in the illustration of Vartov, we see no spires on the hospital, but 3 windmills nearby. In contrast, Christian IV's arsenal, built without a star-shaped fortification in 1604, has a total of 16 windmills nearby, of a specific design called a post mill. Could the star fortifications have something to do with energy storage that was reducing the need for such a bank of windmills? Researcher Michelle Gibson believes the star forts seen all over the world functioned as large batteries, especially since a common name for such a fort is a battery. Of course, metalworking involves battery, shaping the metal by battery or beating. The linguistic connection, though, is intriguing, as such industries may have also been driven by necessity to experiment with forms of stored energy. Perhaps not as bulk storage for a rainy day, but to allow for consistency in a fluctuating supply of current, which is the function of a capacitor. The idea of Renaissance Europe producing and storing electricity isn't as out of place as it may sound. History tells us that electricity was discovered by Benjamin Franklin in 1752 and wasn't employed for public use until the late 1800s. But can we trust this narrative? Because the man considered to be the father of electricity first coined the English word electricity in the year 1600. His name was William Gilbert, and his work was praised by Galileo. William Gilbert was also the chief physician of both Queen Elizabeth and King James I. Gilbert coined the term electricity from the Greek word electron, meaning amber. Because of its properties of attraction when rubbed, what we call static electricity, amber's name electron became associated with such properties. Today, we know amber to be a dielectric material that resists the flow of electrical current, and that can be used as an insulator in a capacitor. In a discussion on amber in his book De Magnete, published in 1600, Gilbert writes that, quote, "The Moors call it carabe, because they used to offer it in sacrifices and in the worship of the gods, for in Arabic, carib means ablation, not rapiens pallius, snatching chaff, as Scaliger would have it." Gilbert is referring here to Julius Scaliger, who was also experimenting with magnetism in the 1500s, and whose son, Joseph Scaliger, published the Amendment of Time in 1583. Anyway, with this focus on amber and electromagnetism happening at this time in history, it's fascinating to find these silver plates with amber centers in the treasured artifacts still housed in Rosenborg Castle today. On his 1606 trip to England, Christian IV would not have met William Gilbert, who had already died in 1603. But it's entirely possible and even plausible that Christian, King James, and Francis Bacon could have discussed Gilbert's work with electromagnetism. In the early 1600s, Christian IV also could have easily used Rosenborg's tall metal spires to harvest ions as low, fluctuating amounts of electricity from the air. Richard Feynman explained the basics of this in Chapter 9 of his published physics lectures, Electricity in the Atmosphere. However, cold ground loses conductivity, so might the star fortifications have been built up to insulate the spire's connection to the Earth? Such questions require further research, but it's still unclear why Christian IV would choose these 3 particular locales for his geometrically aligned star forts, particularly the one on top, the Vartov Hospital for the Poor. There is, however, a curious parallel to Vartov in England at this time. In a speech to Parliament sometime between 1617 and 1621, Francis Bacon refers to a Mr. Sutton's hospital. Sutton was a coal miner and master of ordnance in the British military. A court case resulted after Sutton's death regarding ownership of the hospital property. In Bacon's speech to Parliament, He explained that the hospital was sitting on drowned mineral works that Bacon and King James were interested in reclaiming. Several decades earlier, in 1568, Queen Elizabeth had formed a mining monopoly called the Company of Mineral and Battery Works. Francis Bacon was a child at the time, but his adoptive father, Nicholas Bacon, was one of the first shareholders in this company that forged battery ware. And of course, we saw forges being utilized at the Danish Castellet. By drowned mineral works, could Bacon have been referring to submerged industrial machinery, used either in forging or energy storage or both? And if so, what were they doing on the site of a hospital for the poor? And could Vartov Hospital have been hiding something similar? It's possible the activities of small-scale mining industries were being hidden under the guise of hospitals. This might explain why the Vartov Hospital would require a Starfort foundation and moat. I've copied the full text of Bacon's speech to Parliament in the video description below, as well as a link if you'd like to explore it further. Here in Copenhagen, if only the Castellet and Vartov were utilizing Starfort and moat technology, it could probably be explained away by these early mining and forging industries. But enclosing a castle with the same technology, in the absence of any metalworking, suggests there's more to Starforts than just the battery of iron. Starforts certainly do seem to have some connection to the storage of energy. So what's really under the busy intersection of Trianglin?
Triangeln.
Yeah, that's not what I've been calling it at all, but that's good. Thank you. What's so important about this spot that the Masons and the Red Cross have positioned themselves to it in such close proximity? Perhaps the site of the Vartov Starfort still contains drowned or subterranean mineral works, and perhaps this is the reason for the inverted Masonic logo, describing the activities not of building up, but building down. I'm grateful for any feedback. Please leave your thoughts in the comments, and thank you for watching.